Today's episode is more long form than previous episodes, and so I've actually broken this into two parts. Today's episode, I speak with the first monster I confronted, while part two, the next episode, I lovingly confront another monster and make a surprising discovery in the process. So stay tuned for that next episode to drop. Without further ado, I give you Learning to Love Your Monster, Part 1. Welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm going to be joined by my very own monster, Kelsey. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And first I'm going to go into my story of what it meant to learn to love monsters and how that evolved over time. And specifically the loving of the monster I'm going to delve into with my very own monsters, and we're going to dialogue through that. But first I want to share that when I was growing up, I was really afraid of these overachievers in my life. I would see them from a distance and see the popular girls or popular guys and say, wow, you must have it all together, or your parents have a lot of resources. It must be great to be a star athlete. It must be great to be well dressed, etc. And so I was always afraid of those kids. I thought that I couldn't interact with them. Did you ever feel that way, Kelsey?
Oh, absolutely. And I felt like, at least from my point of view, especially because I grew up without a lot of privilege and without a lot of that scaffolding that some of these other children had, whether it be financial or support or what have you. But I always felt like education was the great equalizer.
Sure.
And that as long as I learned enough, I could mimic
what I wanted to be. Okay, what
absolutely.
You wanted to become.
Whether it was within fashion, whether it was within decorum, manners, however they held themselves, I could affect that same look to be like, oh no, look, I'm one of you. I'm not actually where I came from.
Well, and that brings me to my next point of mimicking monsters. So I used to be afraid of those monsters. I'd keep them at arm's length, and then I'd try to copycat them. If she was popular, I would try to talk the way that she talked, or I tried to be charming the way that she was. And that became really exhausting as I tried to basically become the highlights of everyone else. You really lose yourself in the process.
Absolutely. I think that kind of chameleon is one of those things that becomes like not only exhausting, but you do lose your sense of self.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, you're kind of left wondering like, well, who am I really? Am I all of these things that I'm affecting in a social circumstance, or what am I exactly? Whether it be, is it something that I've been reading? Is it something that I've been mimicking? Is it something that I heard somebody else say and now I'm doing it as well? I do think it is really difficult to discern exactly what is you versus what you've been seeing, versus what you've been taught, and trying to navigate that environment.
And so then with that, I guess the third part of my story is learning to love monsters, which is where I think you play a key role in that process in my life, as there had been dozens of monsters that, I mean, I still feared because they were, killer product managers, or they were killer tech founders, and they had millions of dollars, whatever that might be. And let's bring the audience up to speed with our story. So we met over, fencing. You had joined the adult class, and share with me your first impressions.
Okay, that's so great because, I had been gifted a trial membership in fencing, and it had always been something that had appealed to me. In fact, I had wanted to try it in college, and my college roommate had tried to start a club on campus because she had been a part of her fencing club in high school. However, it didn't work out at our school, whether it was enough interest or what have you. It just never came to be, and so I never did it. But then I was gifted this gift membership, and I remember being really intimidating the night I went for my first session, because you walk into this basement, everybody seems to already know what they're doing.
Sure.
You remember the setup of the welcome desk. It's very far away from like where you walk in.
Very backwards.
And so I was really just kind of thrown by the whole thing, and I had kind of zeroed in on some of the people that seemed really kind.
Sure.
And of course our mutual friend now, Jamie, and I, as we had gone through a couple of the initial classes, we had seen you fence. And it was funny because we had identified you and we had seen that nice little British logo on your fencing gear. You're like, oh, we gotta find out who she is. She's definitely wearing legit gear because this is not American gear, this is British gear.
Leon Paul.
Yeah, exactly. And so we were like, oh wow, she's got like the really sexy outfit. We really want to know who she is. And so Jamie and I had hatched like this plan that we would get to week 4 and then we would approach you. And I remember
that is so awkward.
and I remember that we had gotten this ready and we were just about to get kicked out of the nest and we didn't really want to because we had been really enjoying our
in the beginner's class.
Exactly. We loved our teacher, we loved our group, and it was really intimidating to move into the intermediate adult class.
With a very different teaching style.
Oh, very much so. And we could even see that before we had gotten into it, and it just seemed so overwhelmingly intimidating. And, we were loving this sport, and we were just so, I think, brought into such a, gentle and very technique-centric teaching style. And then we see, this kind of very different, much more open teaching style and all these other people. And it was one of those things where you want to know that you're ready for it, but at the same time, kind of, that self-doubt kind of comes in.
Sure.
But you're also super eager and you don't want to leave the familiar. But we had seen you and so we had decided that yes, this is a person that we need to befriend because clearly she's got the gear, she's got the knowledge, she's already in this class. This is somebody we need to know.
Well, and little did I know that wow, to see women in fencing was kind of rare, and so that was really exciting. I was like, ooh, new friends. And then Chelsea introduced herself to me and called out the sticker on the patch on my lapel for my fencing jacket and said, oh, I just love London. You had another different phrase for that, but we'll leave that out. And you were just really, really excited about London and all the things English. And so you said, where did I get it? And that just started this conversation where I said, well, what keeps you busy or what's your story? And you had shared that you have a master's in fine arts. You went to a special school to become a published writer. You were pursuing your degree in medicine. You were pre-med, and so you were going to interview for a school in London. And what else am I missing out? Oh, you were on the board of a number of nonprofits. You were helping to sue the UN for bringing malaria to Haiti because why not also pick up fencing in your spare time? And I am perspiring heavily, going oh my gosh, I mean, I might have a nice fencing jacket, which was very true. It was 100% accurate.
Fantastic fencing jacket.
I was like, but I'm not on the board of multiple nonprofits. I don't have my master's. I'm not pre-med. I'm not going to go to... And then with 2 kids and just all these fancy things. And I then later shared that it was my dream to have a Burberry trench coat. And I said, one day I'm going to have myself a Burberry trench coat because it was this personal milestone for just my life, and I had wanted one since high school, to which Chelsea quickly responded and said, well, I have 5. And I was like,
Clearly I'm so gracious at that.
But, so she had 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of my life dreams in her closet. And so in that moment,
I have 10 years on you.
Absolutely, you have more life on me. But in that moment, I went, oh my goodness, she might be new to fencing, but monster alert, monster alert. And that's it's fun to say now because we've come so far in our friendship.
It's fantastic.
But in that moment, I was like, oh, fudge muffins. I was like, I mean, I had a nice jacket, But here we are. And so that conversation evolved, and it went from just, oh, I like your jacket, to learning a little bit more about ourselves. And we then grew into a deeper friendship because we were very committed to fencing. We're also very competitive people.
Both very type A and both
Very
very
type A.
driven.
Mhm.
And also, I think it's one of those things where either you can see somebody and say, wow, we share these characteristics.
Mhm.
I don't understand them. Or you can say, wow, we both share these characteristics and I do understand them. And I feel
Correct.
like we fall into the latter category. And it was more of kind of like, at that point, like a mutual admiration. Like we
Definitely.
both continued to push each other harder.
Correct.
And it was like, wow, we are those kind of people that are like, oh, we're looking for those people that challenge us.
Definitely.
That keep us on our toes, that are not just there to be like, oh, status quo. That's not what we're interested in.
No.
And so it was more like what we would play out in fencing would certainly play out
would mimic
our
life.
lives. Yes.
Fencing and life on the strip
Oh my
definitely
goodness.
imitated life.
Yes.
And so even when fencing while sleep deprived after a overnight flight from London, which basically caused a how do I say it? Drunk sensation. I mean, she was not intoxicated, but she was sleep deprived.
It was notorious.
So we decided to fence. Why not fence the infamous
after
Chelsea while under this pseudo intoxication because she was sleep deprived?
So sleep deprived. I remember being almost like giddy.
Oh, I know.
And
it was ugly.
I remember even like Duncan like offering like, do you need a ride home?
Mhm.
I was like, no, I think I got this. Because I thought I had.
Sure.
Basically that I got this was my attitude kind of for everything at that point.
Mhm.
But yes, I think our commitment and our dedication, but also when you love something like that, and I felt like it was always kind of like this meeting of the minds and an emotional sort of thing. And for me at that time in my life, that was my only emotional outlet.
Sure.
And we would all come to fencing and you could tell, like the
Mhm.
tenor would shift with people and that dynamic would play itself out on the strip. And all of us seemed to just reflexively respond to that with each other,
Mhm.
which was the first time I'd ever experienced anything like it. And so it almost became addicting,
Mhm.
where it was like, wow, this is a place where you can actually be yourself.
And be your best self too.
Yeah, I could let that full drive come out
Mhm.
and be like, oh, tonight I am going to own the strip.
Mhm.
And there were other nights when I was like, I know I'm going to be just battered on the strip, but that's what I needed at that moment. I needed to be put in my place. I needed to humble myself at that moment. And then there were other moments when I knew that it would be my place to strive or my place to express myself in a different way.
And so, with that being said, our friendship grew, it evolved. We were very competitive with each other. And we still are to this day.
Absolutely.
We fence in our backyard now because fencing clubs are expensive. But
Fencing for life.
Fencers for life, parkour fencing. And
Parkour.
as we got to know each other during different pivot points, as life would evolve and progress and challenges came up for both of us.
Oh my gosh, when
Yeah.
you made that big move from Smart Web Parts,
Smart things to
Smart Things
when
to,
I were
yeah. And I remember being a part of that transition, knowing that you were applying to that, knowing that you were thinking about leaving,
Mhm.
knowing what that meant, knowing that you were writing those letters to your colleagues
Sure.
that had been your mentors for years,
Mhm.
and wondering, is this the jump I make or not?
Mhm.
And knowing what that would mean for you. I mean, it was all a part of like, we became like this kind of quasi-family that we were like all supporting each other, and we knew about these things because we were meeting 3 times a week,
Mhm.
and we were understanding each other because in that space we had this different form of expression.
Definitely.
And so I feel like that really fostered the connection
Mhm.
in a way that I had never experienced before, where it was suddenly like, you know, between like you and Jamie, like suddenly we had like this like collective little family where like we kind of instantly became protective
Sure.
and like these big ambassadors for each other.
Well, and letting one another know who not to fence that night because
Absolutely.
Not all fencers are created equal, and
Not at all.
and it's for those that are not familiar, fencing can be and is often a co-ed sport, and so women will fence men, and the strength and power behind a man trying to hit you with a foil, a saber, or an epee is very different and disproportionate to a woman. And also, as you hear us talk about the strip, that's similar to a court in basketball. So the strip is where the action happens and where we have to stay on while we conduct a bout, which is similar to a game. So you might hear those words over the arc of our conversation. But we got to know each other. We then had a lot of life that happened to us. And I mean, just like successes and failures across all three of us. We shared it. I mean, there were tears. I know I cried many times on the strip.
I cried as well.
And I'm not a crier.
Me either.
And I'm definitely not a public crier.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, can I just like resoundingly say yes to both of those? That not only am I not a crier, but I'm not a public crier. But in those moments, it just seemed, I don't know, apropos that was the place that we could express the full range of emotion. I have never yelled like I would yell on the strip. I've never laughed like I laughed on the strip. I've never come up behind somebody like I do to you and hit them with a sword in a playful manner.
Yes,
and be
ladies
like,
and
you
gentlemen,
know exactly what I mean when I do it.
Chelsea likes to stab me in the back, literally. Well, that is a thing. That is a real thing in foil fencing, where you can actually whip the blade so that it bends and it actually hits them in the back. Which
this
can I
is where
just
she
say?
gives me too much credit.
Granted, I also can stab you in the back, and it's quite fun.
Absolutely,
but
it is a
so
phenomenal
this love
experience.
gets established, and this monster, with the 5 trench coats. You get to
Who
kind
also
of
appreciates
Of course.
you understanding that as a measure of extrinsic success, because I too was in that same position.
Correct. And to back up, the reason why I love this given piece of clothing or piece of outerwear is because I would see it on the arms of women traveling the world as a little girl while traveling with my parents. And they seemed to, they'd have their brown leather purse and then the trench coat over their arm, and they would just look like they were armed and ready to travel the world. And I just vowed to myself that one day I too would be armed with a trench coat, a brown purse, and that would be my uniform to go and take on life. So that's the backstory of the trench coat and why I love it so much. And so yes, in summary, this is a 5 trench coat person, yet this love is developing as we develop vulnerability. We're crying on the strip with one another about, life's challenges or the loss of a friend's child and all that comes with that. I mean, just really heavy, true life stuff. And what you learn as that love and compassion develops, you start to see some of the layers peel away from that monster facade. And I got to see Chelsea Gonmark, the person, not Chelsea Gonmark. She has 5 coats. And that was the most beautiful thing. So then I thought to myself, well, what if I did this with all my monsters? What if I told them they were my monster, that I loved, adored them, looked up to them, BT dubs, I think you're a monster. And then revealed that. And so I went person to person. Did we have that conversation formally? What did that look like?
We did.
Can you refresh my memory?
I remember you talking about your monsters, and I remember you talking about them with so much admiration.
Sure.
And I had remembered thinking in my head, I was like, oh, I love this as an idea. That here is this word, and words have power.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, especially with my background
in writing,
I loved that here you were setting meaning upon this word, and monster is so perfect, right? Monsters are supposed to be things that we're scared of.
Mm-hmm.
But monsters also in mythology encompass so much power. And so to me, I loved that you decided, it's kind of like that child under the bed, right? You have to make this choice at some point. Like, do I believe in you? Do I identify with you? Am I scared of you? And here you decided, you're like, no, the thing that I fear is the thing that I love. And I am giving this to you as a gift. And I remember you calling me a monster. And I remember thinking at first, like,
what a jerk.
I was like, wow, is that bad? Because I was like, oh, you know what? I know I can come off as intimidating. And at that point in my emotional journey, that could have been very apt.
Sure.
Obviously, I've changed since then.
Yeah.
But at that point, you know, it would have been probably okay to say so, because at that point, you know, I think like as we, particularly as women, as we have to like juggle all of these different identities and what that means to like hold power and to have power, there was something that I knew that with like, there was an intimidation factor that was powerful, but that's also alienating. And it's not something where like the supposition of like how I would like to base friendships off of would have had genesis in. And where even where I was then when we met is very different than who I am now.
Absolutely.
You know, there's been a lot of personal growth since then and a lot of emotional intelligence that has come into play in my intrinsic life versus my extrinsic life. But I can look back at that time and there was like this kind of mixture of like, yeah, okay, I'm glad. You know, like I understand what she's saying and I'm actually like really honored by this. And then there's also part of me where I was like, as I was kind of already kind of transitioning a little bit in my life, being like, oh no, am I overdoing it? And I think unfortunately for women, where I would have never said this before because it would have been too mainstream maybe for me to even say or to come to, or just like where I felt and I didn't want to have anything, any scaffolding to like get me to where I was, you know, to be like, oh, well, I'm a woman, so then I can say this. So there was kind of part of me that, you know, liked the idea of like holding some kind of power without any scaffolding from something else. But at the same time also kind of being like, oh, wow, I actually am kind of like fighting this internal battle because I actually
don't feel like a monster?
Yeah, I don't feel like a monster. And also I kind of, you know, I'm a sailor and I believe very much in the wave raises all ships. So if I'm doing well, why can't all of us be doing well?
Sure.
There isn't some mutually exclusive event that makes me do well and you do bad, because that wouldn't make me happy. And that kind of mode of thinking has always been foreign to me. I've never been a very jealous person, and I've never been somebody that has thought that, you know, whether somebody is beautiful or intelligent or smart or funny, that would somehow diminish from any of my quality. And I actually feel like right now, more than ever, I feel like a lot of women are kind of coming into this phase where there isn't this animosity or this kind of jealousy or competitive living, where it's more like, oh, we can honor each other's traits and have that not take away from who we are. Because that would really be silly, right? Like if I am to compliment you and say, well, Kelsey, you're so confident and amazing to me, it doesn't mean that I'm not confident. You know, it would be silly to say so otherwise, or to resent you, or to like feel bad because I admire this quality in you. Quite frankly, I would rather surround myself with amazing women to be like, look at, this is my squad.
Well,
we are awesome.
The value of learning to love your monsters. Because if you surround yourself with people that are living life well, it, you know, it is the tide that raises all ships, is I think your phrase that you called out. And so when it comes to, if you evaluate yourself as a monster, would you say that you were doing that for external, like was it self-driven, or do you think that much of it was simply a facade because of like your resume? Like you have a very impressive resume, therefore people can draw that conclusion of like anything Chelsea does, she's amazing at. Or do you think that that's just something that you've always been self-motivated and therefore you do hard things?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I think it kind of feeds back into like, you know, like when you first called me a monster, and I had this like mixture of like, wow, that's amazing. I can't believe I'm being counted in her ranks of this. That's really great because, you know, again, we had kind of this mutual admiration of each other. And for me, I would say it's a bit of...
Is it a mix?
I would definitely say it's a mix because I've had to kind of go through that kind of fraudulent experience where
you
I
felt like a fraud, or?
Yeah, where I had a lot of self-doubt.
Sure.
You know, like, wow, well, if she really got to know me, she would realize that I'm not any of these things.
I'm not fancy.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, she would not know. And then there's this other part of me that is very self-driven. I mean, I think about when I was studying for med school. I was studying from 6 a.m. to midnight, and that was all self-driven. There's no external measure of success of that, right? I mean, maybe a good MCAT score, maybe getting into a medical school, yes, but at the same time, there's nobody sitting there being like, Chelsea, you need to study. You need to study neurology today, and you need to study biochemistry today, or what have you. I needed to sit, and I knew what I needed to do, and I had to schedule that out on my own. It was very self-motivated. Where my self-motivation comes from is I remember when I was a really young child. Now, I grew up very impoverished. I know what it's like to not eat. I know what it's like to be scared of where I live. I know what it's like to see a parent struggle with, like, do I buy food or do I buy rent? You know, in a very real way. Now, I could go into a million things about boundaries and about like what I should have been exposed to or not, but the fact of the matter is that's what I was exposed to.
That was your life.
Absolutely. And so I remember when my mother took me to where she worked. I was very young. She worked in a motor factory for Toro, and she brought me into the factory where she worked, and she said, "You're too smart for this. Do you smell this?" And I could smell the varnish. And I looked down at her fingers, which were wrapped in tape to protect her hands from the motors that she was assembling. And she says, if you don't study, this is where you'll end up. And to this day, when I smell varnish, I get sick to my stomach. I nearly vomit. Like, that's how visceral it was to me. And because she knew what my potential was, she knew that I had like a scholastic aptitude that overrode my social position. She wanted to let me know, like, hey, I am doing this. I am making these sacrifices for you. Do with it what you can, right? And so I studied very hard, and that was very intrinsic. My friends were going out getting drunk or doing whatever in high school. I was Hermione Granger. Like, I studied nonstop. That was what I wanted to do. I studied until I got into a private school because I knew that that would help me, you know, all these kinds of things that environmentally, you know, I studied how to not be me, basically. So there was part of me that, like, because of like boundary issues or what have you, that I ran from at probably an acceleration that was disproportionate to what it needed to be in terms of like honoring where I came from or like not having it be so traumatic. Because there is a way to come from poverty and to move into success without it being traumatic. But I was exposed to things that were traumatic. So to me, my reflexive behaviors came from that, was a little bit more skewed than maybe that what it should have been. And so my drive to push myself was even stronger. And I would say almost bordering on obsessive. No matter what I did, I had to be the best at it. You know, I had to, anything that was a shade of who I had been was something that I would discard. You know, like it was more like, oh, this is a piece of me that I don't like. I am so averse to it. Whereas now I have relaxed on that.
You're more
like,
comfortable.
Absolutely. Where it's more like having traveled and lived all over the world and coming out of like the Americanism of like, what's the first thing that people ask after your name? What do you do? As if that is your value. And people make so many assumptions based off of your answer
title.
to that.
Absolutely. And I knew that before. And there was this kind of like needy, external, like, well, let me tell you all the things that I've done. This makes me worthy. This makes me valued. This makes me worthy of love, or what have you. When I would travel and when I'd be living in, like, say, London or South Africa or wherever it was,
Hashtag monster.
People would ask me not what I did, but what I thought about things. Because that is the difference right there, is no matter where you are, what you're doing, who you've become in terms of like your job, that's not who you are. It's how you think and it's how you treat people. That's who you are, right? And so if you're in a population that values that and asks you that, it's a lot easier to be that. Now, I'm not using that as an excuse, but it is harder, I feel, here to do that. And there are times when I feel very solidified in my intrinsic motivation, where I can say, yeah, this is how I think and feel about things. That alone is good enough. I already know I'm intelligent. I already know I'm creative. I already know that I'm worthy of love and like worthy of being able to comment on this. But then there are times when, you know, it's like, oh wow, my title no longer matches with all the things
who
I've
you
done.
think you are as a person.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
your
so
current
suddenly,
role. Yep.
yeah, and so suddenly I'm diminished and
By a stranger.
Absolutely. And it is silly and stupid. Really. And then but it makes me feel that way. And I really have to look at the root of that and say, well, that is something that is coming from me. And that insecurity, the progenitor of that is me. But it doesn't mean that it's not hard, right? You can think one thing and you can feel another thing. And the space between those, from your head to your heart, can be from the earth to the moon. It is a lot of distance to travel sometimes.
So how do you make that journey happen? So if I were to summarize what I heard you say, it sounded like it started as some level of a facade, because you wanted to go far, far away from your youth and your upbringing of what that was. So you wanted to become the exact opposite of those things. You wanted to become educated. You wanted to have resources available to you. You wanted to have the luxury to travel, any number of things. And so you wanted to do the exact opposite. How did you make that transition? Or how are you still making that to this day?
Yeah.
Because I think the listener, I think that's super valuable.
Absolutely. Part of it was what I was doing for myself through education and like through the opportunities I made for myself. I never waited for things to happen. I always made them happen. I almost, with like a frenetic desire, made things happen. I would pursue all sorts of things with kind of an obsession level. That isn't to negate that I'm not interested in multiple things or that I'm not capable of understanding multiple things. It was more like escaping from myself at that time. And now when I look back in reflection, I can see that. You know, whether it be taking flying lessons or taking fencing or
sailing across the largest freshwater race in the North America region.
Yeah, the second largest freshwater race in the world.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. So
these kinds of things where I had to like kind of like prove myself, and that were also not only mentally taxing but also physically taxing. And it's not like I'm the largest person in the world, and so like these things would take a lot of my physicality or mental acuity or strategy or all these kinds of things that I was like just overwhelmingly trying to prove to the world with like this kind of like desire. Now, I think for a lot of people, they can come from all sorts of different backgrounds. For me, like I definitely have come from a background where my parents expected nothing but perfection, and then entered into a relationship with somebody that was also very driven in the same sort of way, where it was like, hey, we have to have all these external measures to show and to prove to ourselves over and over again that we are not where we started. But that frenetic desire becomes really exhausting after a certain point, right? And now I've taken this shift in my life where what do I value the most is actually like real connection with people. Like, are these the people that are kind of like my ride or die sort of people? Will they love me, faults and all?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a big part of being like a real monster versus not, is like, can you still have a fault and use that and incorporate that and let that part of you show, let that vulnerability show, and say, well, this is part of who I am, because this is really what's driving me at the end of the day, right? I mean, you can have all of these other gifts given to you, but really, I do think it's those vulnerable soft spots that are the most tender and the most difficult to share. And as we've walked around the lakes many times together and have talked about, like, wow, these are the things that make me so desperately human.
And so what was that pivot? Like, let's zoom in, like, in terms of, well, what forced you to say, you know, what I've been doing for, you know, 3.5 decades is no longer going to quench the person that I want to become. That, you know, externally driven versus internally driven. What would you point to that drove you to a place where I said, no more. I need to do this because the soft spots matter. I want to be loved for who I am, not just what's on my LinkedIn profile.
No, that's a fantastic question. I think what finally happened was like my separation is suddenly I was no longer a part of this like power couple that had this amazing facade of perfection.
Sure, I would agree with that.
Like, look at us. Like, we are unstoppable. Like, we are both so driven, so perfect. Look at all the things that we've done. That was exhausting. That was really, really hard to uphold because it was such a strong dichotomy from what I was actually feeling.
Sure.
And when I actually took the time to sit, and I remember right after separating, and here I'd walked away from great wealth, from great partnering of business life, this great support, so that I could go and do these other things, right? But I really realized that a lot of these things that I were doing was escapism because I could not feel comfortable in the life that I was leading. Not to say that I don't love these things, but I really took it to, you know, an exponential degree, right? You know, like if I was going to fence, I was going to fence 4 days a week and I would be the best fencer in the class.
And you would fly to London and meet
and I would go,
owner's son of the jacket that I had when we met. She met the grandson or the son of that company. And then took a picture and then, of course, sent it to me because I was like, good night, monster of monsters.
But if you remember, I wouldn't even allow myself to purchase any equipment until I had reached the level in which I've been invited into the competition class. As soon as I got that, then I bought my equipment. Until then, I wore the gross, wet, used equipment.
Lord only knows.
Oh my gosh.
What that germ was.
Oh my gosh. I just remember coming to the club and putting on equipment and having it still be damp. And just being like, oh, this is my hair shirt. This is my prayer to my future self. But you know, when I did separate and I was sitting in not my big house on the lake, not you know, with all of these things, I was sitting in this like duplex that I had picked out, and that was within what I thought would be an acceptable range of affordability. And I was sitting there and I thought, God, if I was the only person in this world, what would I feel like right now? Would I be happy with the choices that I've made? And at that point, I was feeling like, yeah, I am glad I'm here on my own. I actually love myself for the first time in my life. I am valuing the choices that I'm making. Here, I've decided to step away from a medical research career, which obviously would have gained me that kind of, that external validation of you are intelligent, you are worthy, you are smart, like all of these things that like I already knew for myself, but like I needed to have others, you know, say, yes, you are, because this is a job that clearly says, yes, you are. And instead, here I'm sitting in my home and I am saying, okay, I don't mind if I go and get a job at a restaurant so that I can afford to save some money so I can go and make films, so that I can involve my children who are now 10 and 8 and say, hey, let's go make a film about South Africa. Let's go do this sort of thing. Like, there are many things that I'm passionate about that I would like to bring to light. And I have this like technical knowledge, and then I have this creative knowledge where I could combine them and actually do something with it that is where I'm not giving up the formative years of my children. Because if I went to medical school at that time, I would pretty much be trading their time with me to save the lives of other children. And that was really odd to me, because at that time I'd been working for the Sentinel Project for pediatric multi-drug and extreme drug resistant tuberculosis. And I had this like big need to go and help all these other children. And then suddenly I was like, well, I have 2 children. Like,
how old are your children?
8 and 10 now. And so to have these people in my charge, it was like, wait. I think I need to like reevaluate and have this moment. And actually it was a conversation that you and I had that I would go back and say it changed my relationship with the children, and it was the well better conversation. And
Let's double click on that. What was covered in that conversation, so that maybe our listeners can apply that in their own lives?
Absolutely, which I actually think they should. If there was like one thing that they would get out of this, I would say it would be to make a well better meeting with their spouse
Also,
or children.
Also learn to love your monsters. That would be
And
part 2.
that.
But talk about well better.
And I would say to love yourself, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, this all rests on that. Because actually, before this, I would say I was almost fatalistic in my viewpoint of myself and like how I viewed myself in the world. And now I come to myself and say, well, I am valuable. I am lovable. I'm no longer doing those external measures, but the amount of work I've done in my internal life has been so huge in terms of like my emotional intelligence, my personal development, my meditation life, my prayer life. All of these things are so much richer. My awareness of how I interact in the world with other people is so better that I almost look back and cringe at like my former interactions and think, oh my gosh, I can't believe I acted like that, or I missed that because I was so focused on so many other things. Whereas now, to take the time, so Kelsey introduced me to this like awesome concept, and you can totally jump in and say anything you'd like about this, because you had gotten this from
a Target executive who's a friend of mine, and he shared his family meeting structure where on Sunday nights they cross-reference their values and priorities. So values first, then priorities are the second row, and then the third row are activities, based off of the mission and vision of their family. Sounds very much like a corporate executive for you, but he applied it at the family level. And so they would use this filter of what their core values were as a means to determine what they would say yes and no to within a given week, as they would look at their schedule. Everyone else would say what you did well. So, Charlie, I really think you were compassionate to your little sister today. You let her have an extra serving of dessert. And then Mom says what Charlie did really well. And then the sister says what Charlie did well. And then Charlie, when it's Charlie's turn, Charlie has to take ownership and say, well, here's what I could do better. And so Charlie has to say, you know what, though, I thank you for saying I was patient, but I really want to grow in patience. Maybe it's the same concept that you did well, but you want to do it even better. You implemented that in your family, and what did that look like?
Yeah, so for us, what I loved about that is it took this responsibility of evaluation, which I think can be really detrimental, particularly to a family with younger children.
Mm-hmm.
It can be really discouraging, and suddenly it's teaching this value of self-reflection and self-responsibility. And so for us, we kind of tweaked it a little bit to kind of combat some of the emotional uprest that we have had through this transition of our family dynamic change. Because here we have, for multiple years, have been this really tightly knit family, and now suddenly we're going through this transition of being a separate family. And I was a child. I was 9 years old when my parents divorced. Now my children are 10 and 8, and we're going through a separation. And so I was really cognizant of the emotional landscape of what they were going through. And I wanted to make sure that this was something that we could navigate well together as a family. And I wanted to honor their emotions, but also help guide them and to set an example of letting them know from a positive parenting point of view, like what they could do with me where they could feel safe, so that they would have a space where they could have their emotions, where they could feel that they could speak to me in a very frank way. And so it was like this perfect timing of like employing like these other methods of parenting along with what you said. And so for us, we do it on a Thursday night. I have my children on those nights, and it's kind of nice because every other Friday they go to their fathers or they're with me. So to catch them on a Thursday, we've already had a good chunk of the week, some of it together, some of it apart, and we're about to go into a weekend, whether together or apart. So for us, it's a perfect meeting point. And what we first do is we go on a silent walk as a family. So we believe in there is no bad weather, just bad clothing. And so we go on a walk.
Hashtag Minnesota, like living in
Yes.
Minnesota.
Yes. So we bundle up and we go on a silent walk. And I think this is really important because there are so few times where we actually build in and honor the value of silence. And which is hilarious to anybody that knows me because I'm very pulverous. I speak a lot. But there is a real gift in being silent and encountering nature in a silent way, listening, experiencing, smelling, touching, all these kinds of things. And so we come back in this really contemplative mood. So we've already kind of set the stage, right? So for like about a half an hour, depending on the weather, we've already like walked around the creek, the lake, what have you. We come back and we sit together and we have a shell that we pass around for who is the speaker to make sure that none of us are interrupting, that we are honoring the other. So it's me and my two children. And the first thing that we do with our well-betters is we do go around and we say what each person has done well. And then the better part is so great because it does teach that self-reflection and that personal accountability. And even I do it, which I think is really great. And it is humbling. And it's good to show my children that I am not perfect and that I can share with them things that are appropriate. Like I never
Age
speak,
appropriate.
yeah, I never speak ill about anyone, or I never use it as some kind of fodder. But it's more like, hey, look, I can show you what I have done wrong and what I would actually like your help on this week. You know, maybe I say, you know, I would like to have more patience. You know, because what we are ultimately doing is supporting each other in those goals, right? And praising each other for where we've come. And then I use it as kind of like this open space where, combined with like positive parenting techniques, which are really a big proponent of, and an architect, I would say, is Dr. Laura Markham about that. And so I incorporate what you have taught me with what she has taught me together, and I kind of open it up to them. And I say, what is something that I can do this week that makes you feel loved and valued? What is there something that I've done this week that is the opposite of that? And really honoring what they have to say and not responding with reactivity, but with kindness and responsiveness and saying, wow, I did not know. And it has been amazing to learn from these children and then to take that into my life, because there are some things that they've cued me into that I'm like, wow, I could be a better friend if I listened to what my children were saying. I could be a better employee. I could be a better what have you. And just like really taking that in. And we sit and we have this like amazing dialogue. And I never thought I could have had that with a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old until Kelsey had like cued me in on that. And when you had talked about that as something that like a couple in a family should do, and I was like, wow, could this really work with my family? And then it has become this awesome thing where instead of, you know, pushing it off and looking for perfection, but we sat down in the first meeting and said, like, what are our family values? You know, what do we value? How does that help us inform our decision making and our choices when it comes to like activities or how we interact with people? And then kind of like doing this like self-evaluation of how we're doing with it. That mindfulness alone, I think, sets a tone and helps dictate our choices throughout the week. And I know for me, it certainly has, like when I think of like my personal like mantras and stuff, knowing that I'm going to evaluate myself, I stop in like many situations and say, well, am I living up to those things? Am I being the person that now, moving from like this huge external, like what does Kelsey think? What do all these other people think? Which now Kelsey as my friend values more as Kelsey, the monster at fencing, you know, but like what do my children value at the end of the week too? Am I accountable to that? Am I living with the grace and dignity that I would like to? It really did shift. And even like with my friendship with you and like, you know, like what you shared with like your mentor and with other people about like what people are valuing, I realized the areas that I really needed to work on in terms of like, these are the things that actually matter. These are the things that are really important. And how am I evaluating myself and how am I working towards those rather than the other goals?
So as we wrap up, any advice that you would give to the listener as they might face their own monsters, or maybe they self-identify as a monster themselves and they're trying to determine, is this a facade or am I self-driven?
That's a fantastic question.
Number one is advice for the listener. And then secondarily, how do you decouple what your true motivation is?
Yeah, I would say that at the end of the day, you are only responsible to yourself. There's nobody else that sits in your room with you. There's nobody else that determines how well you sleep. Do you feel okay with yourself at the end of the day? Do you need anybody else to validate how you feel? Whether you're worthy of love, whether you're intelligent, creative, witty, what have you. As long as you feel okay with that, I think that that is worth the gamble of everything else. As for like advice with like, you know, children and such like that, I would say continuing to foster that, because we are living in a time when we've never been more narcissistic driven through social media, more competitive living, all of these kinds of things that are like this kind of like daily barrage of
awesomeness.
Look at what I'm doing. I'm only going to show you my highlight reel. I'm not going to show you the pain, the struggle, all of these other things that make me human. Instead, I'm going to show you all those smiling moments. I would say let people have the emotions that they have and honor all of those emotions. People find it very odd when they come to my house and they see all these pictures of my children not smiling. They see them at like the full range of emotion. And for some people that's really uncomfortable. And like for me, I'm like, but that's who they are. Sometimes they smile, sometimes they cry, just like we do. And I think in honoring that full range and not worrying about what is my public persona is far more rewarding, and like finding monsters like Kelsey and like where we can sit and say, wow, these are the things that we do well and these are the things that we struggle with. These are the things we fail at. These are the things that like I don't even know where to begin. Thank God I have you in my life, because it is so amazing to walk through this journey with you, because after all, if we hadn't mastered, what's the whole point, right? So we need each other. We need to rely on each other. And at least for my part, I feel like I've never been at a point where so many women in particular have been so loving and so open and so gifting rather than competitive. And I think the more that we do in that way, the better.
With that, thank you so much for joining me, Chelsea.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before you go, there are a few things to take away from this podcast. First, do you identify with the phases I went through where I first started with fear, then I tried to mimic, and then ultimately learned to love those monsters? Or are you somewhere on that journey, somewhere on that spectrum? Second, monsters tend to fall into two categories. Some are self-driven, well-balanced people, while other monsters prop up enviable facades for the world's approval. The fact of the matter is that it's near impossible to know another person's true motivation until we get close enough to really love that person. That requires two things: courage and compassion. I think this maps perfectly to people with high-functioning autism because living each day in a world that doesn't understand what it can't see, in our case, it's high-functioning autism, and because it takes courage to keep going and we have personal hardships to overcome, we can uniquely be compassionate to the monsters in our own lives. I encourage you guys to stick around for the next episode that should be dropping shortly, or if you're listening to this in the future, you can just listen to them back to back. I confront a second monster and I make a surprising realization in the process of confronting a second monster in love. If you guys thought today's podcast and this episode was helpful, I would be so honored if you'd be willing to share it with someone. Maybe share it with your monster. Maybe share it with a parent or a friend. And don't forget to keep hacking.